Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to the UT Energy Symposium here for April 21, 2020. Today, we have, we'll briefly introduce our speaker today, Suzanne Bertin from the Texas Advanced Energy Business Alliance. But for information, I would point out next week's symposium, April 28th, is Leah Stokes. She's an assistant professor at the University of California at Santa Barbara. She's going to talk to us about policy differences across states in regard to climate policy. So the title of her talk will be Short-Circuiting Policy, Interest Groups, and the Battle over Clean Energy and Climate Policy in the American States. So how do different states treat climate policy differently and what kind of things are going on there? So looking forward to hear from Leah next week. Today, it is a pleasure again to have Suzanne Bertin. She's the Managing Director of Texas Advanced Energy Business Alliance. She's going to talk to us about distributed energy resources today in the context of Texas and the ERCOT market. And that is good because if you know of her background, she has been around and she knows a lot of the details, has been around when a lot of the details were changing with regard to electricity in Texas. She was in the Public Utility Commission, working in that Office of Policy Development in the 90s when Texas converted from a regulatory to a wholesale market structure. She's worked at Reliant, NRG, and other kinds of companies involved in distributed energy, demand response, and understanding the different options we have in the electric sector, and specifically not only with regard to building more generation, but how we can serve electricity demand without generation, but through demand response and other kinds of areas. So it's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to hearing from Suzanne today. And as a reminder, as we switch over to Suzanne's screen, go ahead. We invite the attendees to submit questions in the Zoom chat feature or the Zoom Q&A feature. And potentially if you hold your questions towards the end, then if you want to speak and hold a question, ask a question verbally, try to push the raise the hand button on Zoom and I can select you to ask your question directly. Otherwise, I will read the questions that you submit on Q&A and chat. So with that said, I will now hand it over to Suzanne. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks a lot, Carrie. So as far as today's agenda, what I'd like to do first of all is just go over what do I mean by advanced energy and who is TABA. And then we'll talk a little bit about how the electricity grid is changing due to economics and technology innovation, how DERs play a role and how the integration of DERs is a little bit more a little more complex in the context of the ERCOT restructured market here. I'd like to present TABA's view on a policy framework for how non-wire solutions could be implemented in our competitive market structure here. And so that will get a little bit wonky there. I will warn you now. Then I will hit the highlights of an economic analysis that we commissioned last year to look at value of DERs in Texas. And finally, just touch on a few other things about what else may be happening in this space and what might be next for DERs in Texas. Okay, so first of all, what is advanced energy? And really, it's a broad category of products and services that really constitute all the different best available technologies for electricity grids and markets. And among those are energy efficiency, demand response, storage, natural gas, electric generation, kind of the newer technologies there. Solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, electric vehicles, and all the charging equipment associated with that, biofuel, smart grid, enabling software. I mean, it's really much more even than what I've got here, but it's in a nutshell, it's all the innovations that make the energy we use more secure, clean, reliable, and affordable. And so our member companies are those that provide these products and services in this space. Companies, just to name a few, would include Apex Clean Energy, Clear Result, Enel, Direct Energy, EVgo, SunPower, Schneider Electric, and many more. So we also have members that are large consumers and users of energy, such as Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon. So they're, large buyers of clean energy technologies. Oops. Okay, so our mission is to raise awareness among policymakers and the general public about all the opportunities of advanced energy in Texas. Specifically around, the economic benefits that we bring to the state and the technological benefits to the grid. We have more than 233,000 jobs in the state of Texas, spanning all 254 counties of the state. So we are an important and growing piece of the Texas energy pie. And just briefly, we've got a few different areas of focus for our legislative, policymaker education and advocacy. We are supporting and defending, and promoting advanced energy of all different kinds in legislative, regulatory, and other venues. We also are specifically working on DER issues right now, which is where the focus of this talk will be today. And then we are working to expand markets for electrification of transportation, and also creating more opportunities for our technologies to participate in wholesale markets. So jumping into really the meat of the conversation here, just to kind of set the stage, historically, our system has really been, as I've indicated here, it's kind of more like a power delivery that's treated as a long extension cord. It's characterized in the past by just large centralized generation, one-way delivery, extremely expensive capital investments taking many years to build. And really now what we're starting to move toward is more of a networked system. So it's a network of new technologies that are distributed, and really more of an interactive situation involving customers who are directly involved in choices about energy consumption. So this slide shows a little bit more in detail what I'm talking about here. Again, customers are more and more accustomed to the kinds of service environment that we're seeing in other technologies. So, phone-based apps, cloud-based technologies, things are just moving more toward a service-based model. And really, energy services are not any different from that, other than the fact that they live in this very complex regulatory environment, due to the historical regulation of electricity systems in the past. And so, moving forward, we would anticipate, and that we are already seeing some of this now, that, we have more customer engagement. We're going to have much higher DER penetration down the road. Right now, the competitive market is already developing, vast array of new products and services. Customers are going to be more, selling energy back to the grid, participating in markets, and so on. So it's really a much more dynamic system that we're moving toward. And before we go further into kind of the regulatory issues around this, need to just remind folks that, here in Texas, we do have the competitive ERCOT market, which, as Carrie noted, I was involved with the Public Utility Commission back in the late 90s when this was restructured, and that restructuring legislation was passed in 1999, and it created kind of a bifurcation in Texas. We've got the pink section here that's the vast majority of the state is within the ERCOT region, which has been restructured. We have competitive retail electric providers, competitive generation companies, and the wires companies, the transmission distribution utilities, remain cost of service regulated by the Public Utility Commission. And then in the non-ERCOT areas, this is more your vertically integrated utilities that we see in most of the other states. So it is two different systems or two different ways of doing things. And for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm really focusing on the ERCOT market, although some of these concepts could definitely apply to those other markets as well. So distributed energy resources, are really, they have a lot of characteristics that will provide an opportunity to really disrupt markets. And they're much smaller, so they're less expensive in terms of, like as I mentioned before, with the centralized generation of the past, it was very, very capital intensive projects that took many, many years to get installed. So we've got much more flexibility and modularity, and so a lot faster to get on the system here. So customers are investing in DERs for a variety of reasons as well. It's a matter of just changes in technology and wanting to maybe provide more reliability and resilience at home or at a business. There are substantially lower costs involved in making these investment decisions, and really, it's just a good business for a lot of companies to be investing in these, and similar thinking for residential customers as well, maybe just not as well developed yet as compared to commercial industrial classes. So according to ERCOT, the latest numbers that I have, and there may be some more up-to-date numbers, but as of last year, there were approximately 1,300 megawatts of DERs in the ERCOT market. And, definitely the trend is toward additional penetration in a growing role for DERs in grid operations and reliability. So, increasing transparency and ensuring that DERs are appropriately valued on the system is going to be really important to create more value to the system. So, in addition to kind of saying, what do we mean about DERs, I also want to clarify what I mean about non-wire solutions. And so what I'm talking about here are taking DERs and applying them in specific locations on the distribution system to defer or eliminate the need to invest in traditional utility poles and wires infrastructure. Also, given the fact that we're in the ERCOT market, it's just not as simple as it can be in other markets or outside of ERCOT, where utilities can make a choice to implement some of these technologies on their own. It's really a little bit more complex, and I'll explain that a little bit further in a moment. So capturing the full value of DERs in our restructured market is really going to require a Texas-specific approach to be able to navigate the complexity of our system here. So a little bit of background here. This issue of non-wire solutions and how do these technologies fit into the Texas market really has been under discussion for a few years now. And back in 2016, one of the AEP utilities here in Texas, so this is a wires only utility that is operated in the ERCOT market, they proposed installing a couple of batteries on their distribution system. They were in remote areas, having some reliability issues. And so this would have been, less expensive and, substantially less expensive solution to address the problem. So they, being a regulated wires company, they had to go before the commission to ask permission to do this installation. And there was a huge amount of opposition to this. And really the issue was that there was disagreement as to what the statute said regarding whether utilities could own batteries. And this is because in the Texas competitive market, batteries are generally categorized as generation. And then generation is by default in Texas considered on the competitive side of the fence when we're talking about where those lines get drawn about what's competitive and what's regulated in the Texas market. There was also concern about if a utility is charging and discharging batteries, even if it's just for utility reliability purposes, that charging and discharging does, inject or withdraw from the ERCOT market, and so therefore would be changing wholesale market prices. So it would be kind of an outside influence affecting the ERCOT market prices, and the market participants who participate in that market had a lot of concern with that. So ultimately, this case was not resolved. The commission ended up dismissing the case without prejudice. So they did not deny the application, but they didn't accept it either. It was essentially, they said, we just need more information before we can really, rule on this. So they decided to open up a new proceeding at the commission where it would be more of a rulemaking or open project, which would allow them to be able to talk to all parties rather than a contested case situation where, commissioners can't talk to the company that has an application before it. So they
Suzanne,
created
can I ask
this.
you just to
Yes.
clarify one thing there? Where was the AEP proposed batteries at the time? Or location, do you recall?
So I believe one of them was in Paint Rock, and the other one was in Woodson, I believe, subject to check. So remote areas, very rural. So where, there's not a lot of load growth on the system. And so it's, that seemed like a good solution for them at the time. Okay, so to the commission's rulemaking, they took comments from all the interested parties on, what's this role of batteries specifically, because that's what had come up in the AEP case. But the commission also tried to just, keep it more broad to the extent that folks wanted to comment. Hence this project being called Non-Traditional Technologies Project. So anyway, we filed some comments that really laid out a 3-tier policy framework that we feel is the appropriate way to think about this issue, given the fact that we've got this competitive market structure in Texas. So the first priority of the commissioners and of market participants should always be in support of competition. And, basically our statute, that's what it says, is essentially that competition is the default, and you only do something with a more of a regulatory hand when, there's no way to do it through competition. So competition comes first. Customer choice is very important. Customers need to have opportunities to participate in markets to the extent that they can or want, and to the extent that they want to. And so we suggested that the commission should take a look and see, is there anything else that needs to be done to enhance competition? So things like increasing transparency about what's happening on the utility system, as far as what their distribution planning needs and plans are. And then ensuring that price signals are there to encourage competitive, organic system development. And then, kind of once you're doing everything you can to remove barriers and enhance competition, then the tier 2 was really to look at the existing regulatory structure, which currently provides a financial incentive for utilities to always build capital projects. If they build a capital project, they can earn a rate of return. And so there's really this disincentive to be able to contract for services by a provider. So we wanted to take a look and see how to remove that disincentive and really put a contract-based service on the same level of, same level playing field as just doing things the traditional way. So really what we're talking about here is creating an opportunity where these other newer technologies could compete against traditional solutions. And then finally, our view was, maybe there would be some circumstance where the competitive market is not able to provide a solution, and there's not a non-wire solution that can really address the issue necessarily. And so maybe it does make sense for either utility to go forward with a traditional solution, or in some very, very limited circumstances, there might even be a situation where it would be okay for a utility to go ahead and put in that battery, even though it would normally not be allowed under the market structure. That would be if there's a market failure to deliver a solution. And the comments that the commission received were quite extensive and sharply divided. So there were, the utilities felt that they had the right to be able to own batteries. And, as I mentioned earlier in that AEP case, it had been highly controversial, the idea of utilities owning storage and what effects that might have on the wholesale market. So there was another group of stakeholders, mostly the generators, that were, adamantly against this idea. So the commission suggested that perhaps the legislature should clarify this topic, which could help kind of clear the path for the commission to move forward. And so in 2019, our legislature only meets in odd numbered years. So we had a conversation about this topic. This image just shows one of an op-ed that I had in the Chronicle, basically making the point that our restructured market has been in place for 20 plus years now. And the competition and technology changes and improving economics really have radically transformed our grid. And this next step that we need to undertake is really to get these DERs fully integrated onto the system. And the situation we're in is that the innovation is really way ahead of where the regulatory regime is. And so it's a matter of, it's always a matter of catching up. And so, we were supporting legislation to try to move this forward and get that issue clarified so that we could move forward at the commission. So there was a bill Senate Bill 1941 that was sponsored by Senator Kelly Hancock up. He's from North Richland Hills up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And, this bill basically endorsed the three-tier framework that I had laid out in those that we discussed earlier today on those comments at the commission. And so, it did go actually a little bit further than what we had said in our comments. It drew a bright line and said that storage would be on the competitive side of the fence. It could not be owned by utilities, so it did not provide that kind of last, resort option that we had suggested. But it also endorsed moving to, or you sort of upgrading regulation, if you will, to allow for reliability service contracts to be entered into by utilities with competitive providers of energy storage. And it would have allowed the utility to earn a return on those contracts, sort of making it like a capital asset, just in the form of a contract. So this bill it made it unanimously through the Senate, and then it also made it through the House Jurisdictional Committee. It did not make it all the way through the House and ended up failing. Basically, the calendar ran out before the full House was able to take a vote on it. So around the end of session, or kind of early May, it looked like the bill was moving well, was likely to pass, and our friends over at Rocky Mountain Institute put on an annual event each year where they bring teams together from around the country to tackle thorny issues. And I pulled together a team to look at this question of how the non-wire solutions could be implemented in Texas in the competitive space. And so we pulled together a team that had diverse interests, including from a customer perspective, utility engineering perspective, commission staff, advanced energy technologies, generator and retail, and energy efficiency. So really tried to cover all our bases there to have a conversation on this. And our problem statement really was to address opportunities and challenges specific to ERCOT with respect to non-wire solutions, and try to identify policy solutions to address those opportunities and challenges. So we were really looking to try to find a way where customers, utilities, and the market participants that want to be able to develop these technologies in Texas could all benefit. So that was really what we were looking to do. And it's about a 4-day process of getting together and just being closed into a room for a few days to try to hash through and come up with solutions. So this next slide gives a little bit of sense of some of the issues that surfaced. And I won't read all the sticky notes here, but the main things that were coming out of this is that we really wanted to be able to preserve the competitive market, but we needed to acknowledge that the energy storage was not really a part of the market when we restructured 20 years ago, and the way that things have developed has been kind of there's barriers to these technologies really being fully integrated. So also we wanted to not limit the discussion. We'd only been talking about energy storage at this point, but really, as I said earlier, distributed energy resources are not just batteries. They are a whole bunch of different technologies that can either be employed individually or as a portfolio of technologies on a particular section of the system. So I won't go through this in great detail on this slide, but we developed this process map. This would be a regulatory process. And so really this would be kind of a framework for developing commission rules for how these technologies could be considered in competition with traditional technologies to solve T&D problems. So in a nutshell, what this process would do is really create more transparency in utility planning processes. It would create an opportunity for these new technologies to be able to compete against traditional poles and wire solutions. And then, it would also make sure that utility gets appropriately compensated for that, and that the regulatory disincentives to going down a non-traditional technologies path are removed. So these were some of the things that we saw being addressed in a commission rule. And keep in mind that we were anticipating that as the legislative session would wrap up, that the commission would be coming back to this issue to address how to handle these in a rule. And so these are some of the topics that we thought would be appropriate to address in the rule. So, not everything is really appropriate for a non-wire solution. So there'd be some amount of filtering out and just identifying, a subset of utility work to be considered for non-wire solutions. There'd have to be some kind of stakeholder process to identify whether or not the developers agree that something can be solved with their technologies, and give them an opportunity to bid on those. So, and the process that we had envisioned would have established a competitive procurement process. There's probably some different ways you could do this. You could have, and let me just say also that it's our objective to streamline this as much as possible so that it becomes more of a, frictionless transactional market, so that we're not wanting to just create some big regulatory process here. We'd really like it to be as streamlined as possible, but it's something that would definitely probably take some evolution over time. And then, there was not, we had limited time, so we could not discuss everything under the moon with respect to non-wire solutions in Texas. And, we did not, there was no point in us debating the utility ownership question, because hopefully the ledge was going to take care of that. We also talked about there may be other, ways of doing this. Maybe there's performance-based rate making instituted. There could be other incentives that need to be considered. We didn't talk about transmission level projects and how non-wire solutions might be used there. And we did not really get into the concept of having a distribution system operator type structure. So, in ERCOT, there's, it's like the, ERCOT serves as the operator for the transmission system, and there is no, there's not this sort of the same setup as far as that works at the distribution system. Now, unfortunately, the commission project that was launched before legislative session has been on hold now, or on the back burner for some time. After legislative session, there were a whole bunch of legislative to-dos that the commission was given that they've had to focus on, and of course other priorities, such as right now, obviously the focus is on dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. So a lot of things are on the back burner right now. But in the meantime, we decided to commission a study with a consulting firm called Demand Side Analytics. And the question that we asked them to answer was, how much money is left on the table if Texas cannot fully integrate distributed energy resources into its markets? And that's really looking at it from two different ways. It's looking at it from how do you bring in some competition to the traditional ways of building T&D infrastructure, and then also how do these services benefit the ERCOT wholesale markets. And the report, which I will not go over in great detail here, but I would just say if you want to go dive into the weeds on this, you're welcome to go to our website, texasadvancedenergy.org, and download the report. And we also have some one-pagers that are sort of the Cliff Notes version of the report, if you will. And you can listen to a webinar. It's about an hour long if you want to dig into the details on that. But the upshot was that there is substantial value that is available here if we can get these technologies better integrated in the system. As you can see, the bottom line there, 5.47 billion over 10 years of value if we can get those integrated into Texas. Also, in the meantime, I guess late last year, around October, November, the legislative leadership issued what are called interim charges to the jurisdictional committees that look at electricity markets in Texas. Typically, again, since legislature meets only in odd numbered years, in these in-between times, the committees continue to study issues and hold hearings and take testimony on a variety of topics depending on kind of what's the priority at the time. And it's been clear that the legislative leadership has an interest in these topics because the interim charges really relate directly to seeing what the barriers are to distributed energy resources and non-wire solutions specifically, as well as electric vehicles. So there have already been a couple of hearings. Thankfully, they moved quickly and had some hearings in January and February of this year in both of the committees that are of jurisdiction. The legislators are really interested in these technologies. They're asking a lot of questions. They're, up until recently, they were doing site visits to see how these technologies work in action. It's this idea that, continuing to work on our competitive market, seeing how these technologies really compete well and can create new jobs in the state really resonate with lawmakers. So it's exciting to see that interest in these technologies. Also, market participants who are consistently working with ERCOT staff to try to push the market forward. They're continuing to work on trying to integrate batteries through those ERCOT protocols. So there's been a lot of interest in interconnecting batteries on the ERCOT system, at the distribution level. But even the batteries that are connected on the distribution level have an impact on what's going on in the transmission system as well. And so, ERCOT has really prioritized this as an area to try to get the operational rules right and really facilitate those batteries being able to interconnect and operate in markets. So they had a couple of different things going on this year. The Battery Energy Storage Task Force, which is really trying to get a whole slew of rules in place by the end of this year. And then also in the second topic, distributed generation resources, that even though it's referring to generation, that also includes batteries, and really just trying to identify where there may be some operational gaps, because ERCOT needs to have a good sense of what's happening at the with those distribution level systems as well. But they don't want to be, they've made it clear they're not trying to control the distribution system at all. So there's just need to have the insight into what's going on to make sure that we keep all the lights on. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that there's activity in transportation electrification. Of course, EVs are really just a special case of DER, mobile storage. And, for a variety of reasons, there's a lot of interest in this as well. And, part of that is just the changes in how transportation is going just on a global basis. There's a lot more interest in shared and autonomous vehicles. We've got millennials that are living in the cities and not owning cars, doing more ride share, and we're having more shared fleets and that sort of thing. So a lot of the technology is changing. Really, again, better economics, improved technology, and so that is another factor that we'll need to be looking at going forward. And to that end, the commission has another project where they're evaluating how electric vehicles fit into the overall regulatory framework. Kind of what are the roles of utilities and retailers and third-party EV charging providers. So they're in the process of gathering information from stakeholders and identifying the issues, trying to identify where there's policy issues that need to be addressed in the legislative session. And, thinking back to the three-tiered framework that I mentioned before, a lot of these same issues really apply here again, that, we need to be thinking about how are we ensuring that there's adequate transparency on the distribution system so that, it can help identify the best places for electric vehicle charging equipment to be located. There could be hosting capacity analysis and that sort of thing that could be made available to these competitive providers of technology. There need to be appropriate price signals and to ensure that technology locates in the right place. We need to ensure that the Texas implementation really makes sense in the context of our unique competitive market structure here, and ensure that the companies that are providing these technologies and customers who participate, that they're able to participate in all the markets that they can and they want to. So again, customer choice is really important here as well. As far as where things are going, I went to the LBJ school some time back, a ways back, and one of the things that we talked about in policy development was this concept of policy as a science of muddling through. And these changes are incremental, take a lot of time, and particularly in the context of legislature that meets only in odd-numbered years, and a regulatory cycle that sort of goes along with that, where it just circles back and forth between legislature meeting and PUC taking on additional projects. This work continues. It's going to be an evolving process here. It's not going to be an overnight change here. So on the legislative front, as I mentioned, we've got those interim charges where these committees are going to be studying these issues. They're learning more about the technologies and becoming more comfortable with them as, a piece of the overall Texas energy pie. And then the commission is, reviewing these issues. They're making legislative recommendations for, whether there need to be statutory changes in 2021. Of course, some regulatory actions could be taken by the commission, if they choose. Not everything necessarily needs a statutory change. Although, there's still the same level of clarity that there was before regarding that storage issue. And then finally, stakeholders and ERCOT staff just continue to work together. That is a, ongoing process to try to refine the operational protocols for how, folks can participate in the markets over there and ensuring that barriers get removed and that, folks are hopefully, that folks are compensated appropriately for that. So, still, an ongoing process. I think I will stop there. I've provided a link here. So again, our website, texasadvancedenergy.org, where you can get more information about our organization, our fact sheets about the jobs and economic value we bring to the state of Texas, as well as our policy one-pagers and the detailed study that I mentioned addressing the $5.47 billion value for DER. So with that, I will stop and be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Suzanne. All right, I'll start with a questions on the chat, and I see there's one hand up by initials PR, which I'll let that person ask verbally when I get down here. So there's a question you mentioned. I'm adding to the question. You mentioned that Texas is unique, and yes, as Texans, we like to think we're very unique, but there are things that are unique about the Texas market. So what parallels do you see for non-wire solutions that are happening in other states that are applicable in Texas or not applicable in Texas? Given our mostly energy only market, I guess, as being the mostly unique thing, I suppose.
Right. Well, so in like in the AEP case, they came forward and had a solution to put in a battery. And if they had been just an integrated utility, then they would have, a vertically integrated utility, they would have been able to go forward with that project. There would not have been this whole controversy of, what's the effect on the wholesale market? Is that appropriate? Is that appropriate or is that inappropriate, market participation? So in some ways, it's simpler to deal with this in other vertically integrated markets. But this, the opposite side of that is that, a utility does have to get permission for everything. So if you can set the stage right here to facilitate competitive market development, then, hopefully we can get more efficient outcomes. But, these issues are being addressed in other markets, really, looking at how can you get more transparent distribution planning and really taking an active look at this. So this is being considered in other states, and there are actually a lot of parallels there.
Okay, Mr. PR, would you like to ask a question? I think I'm trying to enable you to do that, but not quite enabled him to do that yet. So I'll go on to another question while I try to figure that out. Here is a question related essentially to carbon pricing. do you have any views? Does TAEBA have a view on carbon pricing in Texas? If we're a wholesale market, should it be relatively easy to price carbon, at least at the wholesale level?
We don't have a view on that right now.
All right, Mr. PR, go ahead. I think.
Yes. In other states, is there more extensive development of battery storage just because of the different regulatory environment?
Well, we have quite a bit of battery development here, actually, that is starting to be quite a lot because of the fact that you can just provide it in the competitive market, and so it's even though you can't do the non-wire solutions, there's no real process for handling non-wire solutions in our regulatory structure here. We do actually have a lot of storage developing because of the fact that you can just interconnect and get on the system like other resources in the wholesale market.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. I suppose you might have used the term on one of your slides, more transparent distribution planning. Can you elaborate more on your views on, I guess, planning at the distribution level? I don't know, planning scares off people, even though at the distribution level in Texas, even though it occurs.
Right, yeah. I mean, I would think about it this way. So at the transmission level in ERCOT, the market participants have a good idea of what the network looks like, where the needs are on the system. Everybody who's participating in that market has a clear idea of what is happening on the grid in terms of where those needs are, where the deficiencies are, and where there's extra capacity. Whereas at the distribution level currently, utilities have, I'm sure, robust processes in place, and they're all, in-house. They have their own processes, but it's a black box to everyone else. So, it's just not, and I'm not saying that, we need to be just publishing information out there on the internet for anybody to be able to see what's going on all aspects of the system. Definitely not that. But there should be a way to provide additional information to companies who would be wanting to interconnect so that they can have some idea of where it may be a better or worse idea to interconnect in terms of what the hosting capacity is and that sort of thing.
Okay. There's a person sort of asking for clarifications about electric vehicles and the role as, I guess, as a non-wire solution or a distributed solution. So can you expand on that and perhaps say what do you think the potential is there for EVs and addressing non-wire solutions?
So EVs are definitely a little bit more of a sort of down the road option in terms of getting fully integrated into markets in terms of, like vehicle to grid services. Certainly, the load shape on the system can be affected based on choices that electric vehicle drivers make about when to charge. And so the pricing that we have in place under the competitive retail market plans that are out there are going to either provide incentives or disincentives about when to charge, depending on the plan that any particular customer chooses. But there are plans out there that would encourage people to be, charging at night when it is the most efficient time to be charging. So that kind of interaction, that's something that can happen right now. So these electric vehicles can have some impact on the grid in a positive way. And then further down the road, we need to identify, what are the different markets where they could participate, whether they're ERCOT markets or there could also be additional distribution level services that get identified to benefit a local distribution utility. And that is something that nobody has really looked at in Texas yet, but something we need to do.
Okay, thank you. I got one more here on the list, and then I'll ask one myself afterwards. So here's one from the list. Were there any, or have there been any legislative, Public Utility Commission or ERCOT directions or rules clarifying the issue of whether transmission and distribution utilities can contract with third parties to provide reliability services with energy storage or perhaps other things, or what's the status of these kinds of discussions if they are going on?
Yeah, so I would say, first of all, I'm not a lawyer, so there could be, so there's not like any kind of legal opinion. But it seems to me that there's not really anything that would stand in the way of a utility contracting with a competitive provider for some kind of service to address a reliability issue, except for there's this regulatory disincentive, which is under traditional regulation, a utility earns money if it builds projects. It does not, if it's just a contract, then that's just an expense that gets passed through. And so there's no incentive from a regulatory standpoint for a utility to ever contract for this stuff, even though it might be the, better solution. So we still need I think that it's not any more resolved in terms of that ownership issue and sort of clarifying that it does make sense to put a rate of return on these capital lease contracts, and so it would be nice to see the legislature to go ahead and pass that bill that they were, or a version of that bill that they were looking to, and that passed last session and almost made it across the finish line. And then the commission can get back to how would you implement that in terms of, implementing the detailed regulations to make that happen.
Thank you. So from me, you didn't really address this, but I thought maybe you're a person to throw this out to. At the beginning of your presentation, you sort of drew the parallel between the information age network and the electric grid as a network. I guess in today's world, some people might be experiencing sort of throttling of their internet bandwidth, and this is capable due to the mechanisms that are out there to affect the rate of transmission of information. I guess this is not too prevalent on the electric grid so far, but we could have technologies that do this. Do you anticipate sort of demand response and DER going so far as, say, like down to the, let's just say, residential level, letting people contract for a certain maximum rate of power to their house and having the utility throttle it and using this as a extra demand management type activity?
Well, I think there are, potentially a lot of different, business arrangements that we can't necessarily even, certainly on this call, can't necessarily envision. We've got a lot of creative providers out there that, I think 10 years ago, nobody would have expected to have free nights and weekends for electricity service, as is out there in the competitive market. But, we already have demand response programs where customers can opt into allowing their thermostats to be used. We already have customers who are investing in solar panels and putting, storage in their garage, and, buying electric vehicles. And so really there's, still a huge untapped potential here for, different products and services to be developed. And it really comes down to what are customers, what are they willing to do in terms of, compensation in exchange for taking certain actions. But to the extent that a provider can come forward with products that make it easy for customers to not really have to think about it too much and just, set it, forget it, and just cash in on payments, then definitely there's going to be folks taking the providers up on those offers.
Right, thank you. Perhaps we'll end with just one more question here. Maybe this gets back to batteries and ownership. So ownership of behind the meter application batteries, and I think one of these questions might refer to what might have been your win-win-win slide, but I'm not sure. Talking about monetizing assets for customers, perhaps let's just say residential customers, maybe. And in this case, are there different things that need to be done? First question from this person is, what exactly do you mean by monetizing assets for customers? And I'm adding that maybe there's a question of, can people monetize properly if I own batteries at my house or any other entity owned batteries? Are they able to properly benefit from that investment?
Right. So, currently in the retail market, you can, for example, sell back surplus solar generation to your retail electric provider. So certainly if you had storage, that also provides additional flexibility for being able to do that sort of thing. But generally what we're referring to on that slide is just the concept that, folks are going to be investing in these technologies, whether it's at home or if it's for a business, for, backup generation at a grocery store or whatever the case may be. And to the extent that they've already spent the money to get these assets in place, or if it's part of maybe the decision of whether to invest, that they should be able to, if they can qualify to participate in a market and they want to participate, then they should be able to. And if you can make money through additional revenue streams, then it's going to just lower the cost and make it pencil out a lot quicker for folks, so they can make those decisions to go ahead and invest if they're maybe thinking about it still.
Right. You just triggered me a follow on. So is there anything you can say about your knowledge about the differences between, let's just say, selling back electricity to the grid in Texas in competitive retail areas versus municipalities? So like Austin has a value of solar tariff, and I think the sell back rate is essentially roughly the same as the purchase rate as a retail cost. So that's pretty much a one-to-one correspondence, but it's not the same everywhere, right? So I don't know if you can say anything about wholesale.
Yeah, it's definitely not the same everywhere. And in the competitive market, I will say that it has, for one thing, it's up to each individual provider to decide, what they want to offer. And, the way the competitive market works is if you're a customer who has solar and you want to be able to sell back, you have to shop to find a provider that, that offers you a deal that you are agreeable to. So it has varied over time as to whether that's, paying back, full retail on the first 500 kilowatt hours. And then after that, it's, some lower amount or whatever, but it's really just up to each provider to set that rate. And with utilities, of course, then it's a regulated rate that, well, in the case of Austin, it's not regulated by the Public Utility Commission, but if it's a vertically integrated utility in, like outside of ERCOT, for example, they would have to, bring a rate forward to get that approved by the commission. So it just really, it's wildly variant across the, different utilities across the country.
Okay. Suzanne Bertin, Managing Director of Texas Advanced Energy Business Alliance. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Carrie.